All right, so thank you again, everyone, so much for joining us for our Financial Aid 101 webinar. My name is Amy Sawdey, and I am one of PHEAA's Higher Education Access Partners. Um, if you haven't heard of PHEAA before, we're the Pennsylvania Higher Education Assistance Agency. So we're here in the Commonwealth and we provide state grants and some other state programs to eligible students. And we'll talk a lot about the state grant program and some of the other programs later on in tonight's presentation. But before we begin, I always like to just first start off with a quick definition. So what do I mean when I say financial aid? And financial aid consists of the funds that are provided to students, to families, to help pay for post-secondary educational expenses. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, a post-secondary education is any education after high school. So whether your student is going on for a certificate program, an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, or beyond, financial aid is there to help pay for some of those expenses, things like tuition, fees, housing, meal plans, etc. But the key word to this definition is that financial aid is there to help. But rarely do we see financial aid covering the full cost to attend a higher education institution. So it's extremely important to start thinking about what can we, maybe me as the student or we as the family, what can we do or what could we afford to pay, right? If there's a leftover amount not covered by financial aid. And if we aren't able to pay, right, out of pocket, then what are our options and what might be best for us? And that's what we're going to talk about a lot tonight. Now, there are three main types of financial aid. So there is our gift aid, that's our grants and our scholarships. That's free money, money that doesn't have to be paid back. Then we have self-help type of financial aid. So that could be a work study program where the student works and earns funds to help them with the cost associated with higher education. And then, of course, lastly, our loans. Although loans are money that have to be paid back, they do count as a type of financial aid. So it does count as a type of financial aid, but you have to understand with a loan that that's money you're borrowing, money that is going to have to be paid back in the future. Now, where does all of this money come from? The money comes from different funding sources, the federal government, the state government, which would be me with PHEAA, the school or college and beyond. And you might be wondering, well, why does it matter, right? If I'm getting financial aid, why does it really matter where it's coming from? And my biggest thing with this is it matters because each of the funding sources has their own forms or applications, has their own deadlines, has their own requirements. And so especially when it comes to that free money, those grants and scholarships, you definitely want to make sure you are aware of all of the application processes, deadlines, and more. And so because that differs with different funding sources, it's important to know what those are. And we're going to talk a lot about that tonight. But what we're going to do is we're going to first just start off and we're going to go through the 5 steps to financial aid. And this is really how our whole presentation will be broken up, starting with step 1, which is look for free money first. When it comes to searching for scholarships, it is never too early to begin the search process. So even if I have students that are in 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, they can begin searching for scholarships. Now, they might not be able to apply yet. Maybe the applications aren't going to open up until a student's senior year or spring of a student's senior year, but at least the student can begin searching for those opportunities and maybe even creating a list of scholarships that they find along the way that they are hoping that when they're a senior that they can apply for. Because typically the application questions, the requirements, the deadlines for scholarships stay the same year after year. So if a student finds a scholarship in 9th grade and they write that down and they revisit it a few years later, it should still be there. And it's probably going to have just about the same information. So I definitely encourage students to start creating that list early on because it's just going to save them time senior year. Also, I'm going to encourage students not to ignore scholarships of smaller amounts. I talk to students on a regular basis, and sometimes I hear from them that, a scholarship is only $500 or it's only, $600. And is it really worth my time to apply? And I'm going to tell them it is. Yes, it's worth your time because typically those smaller scholarships have less applicants. So you have a better chance of receiving a scholarship for, say, $500 or $1,000 compared to one for $10,000. And they can add up over time. And lastly, they do want to search for scholarships every year. So the scholarship search process does not end when they end high school. In fact, every single year they're attending a post-secondary institution, they should be applying for scholarships. Now, there are different types of scholarships, and one of the biggest places that students should be checking for scholarships is through the actual college, university, or post-secondary institution. I mean, that's really the number one source for scholarships. So when I hear students are saying I'm getting an $8,000 yearly scholarship or a $5,000 yearly scholarship, most of the time I'm going to assume that's coming directly from the college because typically the colleges can offer those types of money to students. So that's a huge source of scholarships is through the actual college or colleges. So students need to be aware of what scholarships are even offered at the colleges they're interested in. Are there different application processes or different forms? Are there certain requirements that they have to meet in order to be considered for those scholarships? These are questions you should be asking when you're doing college visits, whether it's virtual, in person, or going to college fairs, asking them about scholarships. There are some colleges that do not offer merit-based scholarships, meaning scholarships that aren't based on financial needs. So might be based on your GPA or test scores. Well, if you're hoping to get a merit-based scholarship, you want to know going into the search if that's even something that you might receive from the school, right? So ask them about that. Maybe they can even give you a general idea of what the scholarship recipients look like, right? What is the average test score or the range of test scores or the range of GPAs or whatever it's based on at that school? Can they give you a picture of what that might look like to see if you might even be considered for the scholarship opportunities at that school? Now, also you can check local and regionally as well. So there are local organizations, regional organizations that are offering scholarships. So I definitely encourage you to look for those as well. If you're here in Allegheny County or some of the surrounding counties, I'm going to encourage you to check out Pittsburgh Foundation. So the Pittsburgh Foundation, I'm putting it in the chat. They are a great resource for scholarships. And these are all local, so Allegheny and some of the surrounding counties. So I definitely encourage you to check out the Pittsburgh Foundation, and the NEED organization here in Pittsburgh as well is a great local resource that offers scholarships and grants to eligible students. So I definitely encourage you to check out those two websites to see if anything might apply to you. And look beyond that list. Check with your high school. A lot of our local high schools offer scholarship opportunities to students. So check with your high school, check with your counselor. They might know of other local and regional scholarships as well that you can apply for. And then lastly, there are national scholarships. I will be sharing at the end of the presentation a few national scholarship links. So places where you can go to begin searching for national scholarships. I just want to remind you as well, though, that I am recording tonight's presentation, and I will send out the recording and the presentation slides to all of you next week. So if you can't stay on until the end to get those national scholarships, don't worry, you're going to receive these slides next week. So you'll be able to go back in and you can look for those links. Okay, now one thing I'm going to encourage all my students to do if they haven't already is to create a scholarship resume. Now, this is not like a job resume. It's not limited to a page or 2 pages. It can be as long as the student wants. And this is really where they are listing anything and everything they've done since 9th grade. So the scholarship resume should include their whole high school experience. And I get asked, what about 8th grade if I had a really meaningful experience? Write that down too, because it doesn't hurt to have a little bit extra. But anything they've been involved in, any awards that they've received, they would want to make sure that it's included on the scholarship resume. That way, when the scholarships ask about these types of things, hey, list all the activities you've participated in. Oh, the student can go right to their scholarship resume, copy that section, and paste it onto the application. So this will definitely save the student time when it comes time to actually applying. Now, in addition to asking the college about scholarships, one question that you would also want to ask is, will receiving any outside scholarships affect my financial aid? So with my state-related schools and our state schools, they cannot reduce your institutional scholarship or the scholarship that they're offering you at the college because of money that you've received from outside. But our private institutions do have this ability. So a private institution could say, hey, we offered you a $2,000 scholarship. It's now July, classes are starting next month, and we found out that you're getting an outside scholarship for $2,000. So instead of us giving you $2,000, we're just going to use that outside scholarship of $2,000 and basically replace our money with it. And so that way you're still getting a $2,000 scholarship, but it's not coming from the school. And so this is important to know, because if you're getting a $2,000 scholarship from the school and an outside scholarship, in your mind, you're thinking, oh, okay, in that situation, that's $4,000, where the school has the ability to displace some of those scholarships, and it could reduce your overall eligibility. And so this is something you definitely want to be aware of, and you want to be aware of it early on in the search process as you're narrowing down your colleges, not after you've already chosen your school, received your bill, and then found out about an outside scholarship. So I definitely encourage you to ask that question, whether you're going on a visit or you're going to a college fair, but ask them about that. Will receiving any outside scholarships impact my aid at the school? That's something I would want to be aware of. Now, step 2 is to know your deadlines, and especially for my seniors, there are a lot of deadlines that you're going to have to keep track of. Deadlines to apply to college, deadlines for scholarships. Some schools even have deadlines for when you have to submit the FAFSA application. So what I encourage my students to do is to create a master calendar where they utilize the college websites and write down all of the important dates throughout the year. And this way, if they're interested in 6 schools, the master calendar will have the dates for all 6 lined up nicely. And this way they can stay on track throughout senior year. Now, one deadline that they can make sure that they include on the calendar is the Pennsylvania State Grant deadline. So in order to be considered for the Pennsylvania State Grant Program, students must complete the FAFSA application no later than May 1st. So the state grant deadline is a yearly deadline. So every year you have to submit the FAFSA application, and every year you need to submit it prior to May 1st. So even for my returning college students, they need to submit the FAFSA prior to May 1st. So because it's one of those annual reoccurring deadlines, it's one that I personally put in my phone, and I put it as a reoccurring deadline. That way I don't forget about it, right? So if you have a student and they're going for a bachelor's degree, that's 4 May 1st deadlines that you're going to want in your calendar. So if you put it as a reoccurring deadline, you'll be sure that you don't miss out on being considered for that free money. Now, the step 3 is to complete the FAFSA application. And I briefly mentioned the FAFSA, but what is it? The FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. So it's completely free to complete this form. And just by completing the form, you're being applied for all types of federal programs. So you're automatically applied for federal Pell Grant, federal work study, federal student loans. We at PHEAA use that information to determine eligibility for our Pennsylvania State Grant Program and some of our other state programs. And many schools, many colleges and universities also use FAFSA to determine eligibility for institutional aid. So one form applies you for many different funding sources and many different types of financial aid. And that's why it's so crucial to get the FAFSA completed. So how can you do that? Well, you would complete it online. You would go to studentaid.gov/FAFSA. Again, this is something you'll do every single year that a student is attending a post-secondary institution, and it will begin a student's senior year. So if I have any seniors that are listening or parents of seniors, you will be completing the FAFSA application for the 2024-2025 academic year. And that's because if students are considering going to school in fall 2024, spring 2025, they need to complete the 24-25 FAFSA. Now the 24-25 FAFSA is delayed. Typically, the FAFSA opens up every year on October 1st, and that would be October 1st of a student's senior year. But this year for my seniors, the FAFSA will not be available until sometime in December. Now, we do not have a date. So I do not know the date that the FAFSA is going to be open. People have made speculations, people have made guesses, but no one truly knows when the FAFSA application will be available. All we know is that it's going to be available sometime in December for seniors. Now, I want to mention that this is just a 1-year hiccup. So it is delayed to December this year. After this year, it's going to revert back to October 1. So it's just a one-time delay for all of my seniors and also for your returning college students because they have to wait until December to complete the application. Now, although we don't know the date in December, if I had to guess, like I said, people make guesses. If I had to guess, I would guess it would be towards the end of December. And typically on a normal year, the first week or two that the FAFSA application is available, it acts really slow. There are bugs or issues with the site that causes it to crash, causes it to be delayed, just really slow. You don't want to have to deal with any of that. So what I would recommend is even if it is available in December, I would not even try to access the form until sometime in January. That way you give yourself some time, build in time for the FAFSA to catch up and to get back to the normal speed. Just because there's so many users that first week that log in and it really causes the site to be overloaded. So personally, I would wait until January to even go on and try to do the FAFSA form. Okay. And again, that's just this year for my current seniors. Now, one thing that you can do though, in order to access the FAFSA form, you do have to create FSAID accounts. This is something that I would do in November, like late November or early December. I would go out there and create the FSAID accounts. So the student, the one who's applying for financial aid, needs to create an FSAID account. In addition to the student, the parent or parents in the household also need to create an FSAID account. Now we are going to talk about which parent or parents' information is required on the form, but the biggest thing for the FSAID accounts, and we're going to get to this later, but the biggest thing is if there are two parents in the household, and we will define that in a bit, but if there's two parents in the household and they did not file married filing joint, both parents will need to create two separate, so they will each create a separate FSAID account. So each parent would have their own username, password, login information. If parents filed married filing joint, only one parent has to create the FSAID account. Okay, and we're going to talk more about the parent information in a bit, but I just want to try to clear that up a little bit because in some situations it's going to be the student and one parent. Again, if there's one parent in the house or parents filed married filing joint, only one parent has to create the FSAID. But if there are two parents in the house and they filed married filing separate, or neither filed taxes, or one filed taxes and the other didn't, then both parents would have to create a separate FSAID account. So if I was the student, I have two parents in my house, parents filed married filing separate, overall we would have 3 separate FSAID accounts, one for me and one for each of my parents. And again, this is something that you can work on in November or in December. In fact, I'm always going to encourage you to create these accounts at least a week prior to doing the FAFSA. The reason is because this account does have to be verified by Social Security Administration. They have to verify your name, date of birth, Social Security number, and that verification process can take at least 4 days to go through. If you don't have the verification through, you won't be able to access all of the tools within the FAFSA, and so it can just be a pain. So I definitely encourage you at least a week before you want to do the FAFSA, get those accounts created, and you can create them early on, right? For seniors, maybe November and December, go on and create those accounts. In addition to creating the accounts, I would also encourage you to make sure that you have the information that's going to be asked of you available. And I did see a question about parents that are divorced. We're going to get to that in just maybe 3 or 4 slides. But the information that's going to be needed on the FAFSA, and this again is for the 24-25 FAFSA for all current seniors, you're going to need social security numbers. You'll need this when creating the FSA ID account as well. So just make sure you have these on hand. You'll also need email addresses. I encourage all students, do not use your high school email address. Make sure you're using a personal email address when completing the FAFSA, creating the FSA ID account. If your student does not have a personal email address, now is the time to get one created. In addition, the 24-25 FAFSA is also going to be asking about 2022 tax information. So you will want to make sure that you have your 2022 federal tax returns and W-2 forms. Now, this is for the parent or parents in the house and for the student. So if students filed taxes or had earned wages, they would need their tax returns W-2s. If parents filed taxes or had earned wages, you'll need your tax returns or W-2 forms. Oh, I saw a question that came in about the FSA ID account. What if a parent already has an account for an older child? You as an individual can only have one account. That account is linked to your name, social security number, and date of birth. So if you have already created an account for yourself or for an older child, you will use that account that you've already created to sign off on the student's FAFSA. You will not need to create another one. In fact, if you go to try to create another one, it'll tell you there's already an account out there that exists, and then you can just reset your password and get into it that way. Okay, in addition to the tax information, you're also going to be asked about asset information. Now, whenever the FAFSA asks about assets, it is asking about the current assets, current information. So based on the day that you are filing the FAFSA, what do your assets look like? And there are a couple of questions. The first question is, how much total do you have in cash, in any checking accounts, and any saving accounts? And it's going to ask this of the student, and then later it's going to ask the parent to respond for the parent's assets. So you would just report the total cash, checking, savings accounts, one total value, onto the FAFSA, one for parent and one for student. The second question is, how much total do you have in investments? Investments would be things like stocks, bonds, mutual funds, money markets. 529 or college savings accounts do count as an investment. So if the owner is the parent and the beneficiary is the student filling out the FAFSA, you would have to report the total amount for that student. I also had a parent that owned an account and the other parent was a beneficiary. That would have to be reported as an investment. But let's say I'm a parent and I have multiple accounts for multiple children. I would only report the total account, the total amount in the account for the child filling out the FAFSA. Okay. Let me know, use the chat feature if you have questions as we go through this. One question was, what if one of the family members doesn't have a W-2 form, but we have a Form 1099? If you don't have a W-2 form, you won't need the W-2. So just make sure you have your tax information. If you don't have a W-2 form, you'll be able to pull that right from your tax return. Okay. I see a good question about investments, and I did forget to mention this. When it asks about investments like stocks, bonds, mutual funds, etc., this does not include retirement assets. So if you have a retirement 401k or a retirement IRA, this would not be reported on the FAFSA form. So if it is specifically for retirement, it does not get reported on the form. Now, the best thing about the FAFSA form is that there are little question marks after all of the difficult questions. So after all the income asset questions, and it's a help tool. So if you get to the question and you're like, I'm not sure what it's asking, or is this included, is this not included? You can click on the help tool. It'll open up a window, and the window is going to exactly explain what it's looking for. So especially when we get to those investments, if you open up the help tool, there will be a list of what is an asset and what is not an asset. I always encourage you to utilize the help tools because it's really easy to not think about something that's an asset or even be considering something. And then you look through the list and you're like, oh, I have that account, or oh, that's not reported. Let me remove that from the calculation. So I definitely encourage you to really read those help tools, open those up, double check the information. That's what they're there for, to give you some more guidance. Okay, so when the student is completing the FAFSA, so for those of you that have done the FAFSA before, it's a little different this year. It used to basically be one form that would be completed in total. And this year, the way that they're doing it is it's almost going to act as if it's two separate forms. So it's almost going to act as if it's the student portion and a parent portion. And so it's really to make it an easier process, a little bit smoother of a process. But for those of you that have done the FAFSA before, it might just look a little bit different or feel a little bit different than before. But what I would say is the best way to do it is to have the student log in first. So in January, right, let's just say in January, FAFSA is available. You go out there, the student logs in to studentaid.gov, they start the FAFSA form. The student is going to be walked through all of the steps here on the screen. So they're going to go step by step through each of the questions. When they get to the end, they will invite the parent or parents to contribute their information, and then the parent will have their own separate section. And I'll show you a little screenshot of that as well. But let me go through a couple of the things with the student questions, because I think it will help clear up a little bit of information. Okay, so one of the questions or one of the sections is about the school selection section. This is where the student needs to list any or all of the schools that they're considering. So if the student is considering any school, they would want to list it on the form, and they can actually list up to 20 schools at a time. So any school they're considering, make sure that they list on the FAFSA form. If you submit the FAFSA and you later realize you forgot about a school or you want to go back and add a school, you can do that. You can make changes to the school selection list at any time. So even after it's been submitted, you can always go back in and update this, but the student would have to list one by one each of the schools that they are considering. Okay, now after school selection, the student is going to be asked a few questions to figure out, are they a dependent student, meaning they must provide parent information, or are they independent, meaning they can skip the parent questions. So it's going to walk the student basically through these questions one by one to see if any of them apply to the student. If they do not apply, then it's going to say, hey, you are a dependent student based on those questions. You must provide parent information. So questions. Are you 24 years or older? Are you married? Do you have any legal dependents, such as a child that you provide over 50% of their support? Are you a veteran or serving on active duty? Have you already received a bachelor's degree and are working on a graduate level degree? Are you a legally emancipated minor, or does someone other than your parents have legal guardianship over you as determined by the court in your state of residence? Are you an orphan, ward of the court, or were you in foster care since the age of 13? Or are you an unaccompanied youth and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? So the student would go through all those questions. If they're answering no to those questions, none of those apply, then again, it's going to tell them, based on your answers, you are a dependent student and you must provide parent information. Now, there are some situations where parent information cannot be provided. So there would be a special circumstance in that case. So in that situation, after the student gets through these questions and it says you're dependent, there will be an option for the student to select, like, I have a special circumstance, I'm unable to provide parent information, and then they will be able to skip over the parent stuff. But in those cases of special circumstances, there is an appeal process. The student does have to submit information to the different colleges that they're interested in order for them to be considered an independent student. So I did see a question that had come in about grandparents that haven't legally adopted a student, and what would we do? That would be a special circumstance. If grandparents or someone other than a parent has legal custody over the student, technically they are not automatically dependent, but they can work with the school to do an appeal process to say, hey, this is why I don't live with my parents. This is the reason. This is who I live with. If they have any paperwork, they can provide that. And then depending on that information, the school can determine if that student is independent or not. So again, they would, in a special circumstance, they would select that they have a special circumstance, and they can work with the colleges to go through that appeal process. Okay, now for those students that are dependent and that are providing parent information that don't have a special circumstance, they're going to be walked through what they're calling a parent wizard. Okay, it's not really a wizard at all. It's just a few questions to figure out which parent or parents' information is required. So basically, if the student's biological or adoptive parents are married and they live together, the student would have to report both parents' information. Now, if the parents are unmarried, but they live together, right? So either the adoptive parents or biological parents, if they are unmarried, but they live in the same house, then the student would still have to report both parents' information. Now, in the case of divorced or separated parents, the FAFSA is going to say that you need to use the parent that provided the most financial support for the student over the past 12 months. So the day you sit down to do the FAFSA, which parent provided the most financial support over the past year? Whichever parent that is the parent's information that needs to be reported. So if I'm the student, my mom has provided the most financial support for me over the past year, then my mom would be the one that would be reported on the FAFSA. So my mom's income, my mom's assets. Now, if my mom is remarried, so let's say my mom's remarried and I have a step parent, then my step parent's information would also be required. So it would be my information, my mom's information, and my, let's say, stepdad's information in that case. So all three of our information would be required on the form. But if mom is not remarried, it's just me and my mom, then it would just be me, my information, and my mom's information. Whoops. Okay. I saw a question that came in. How is that measured? The parent with the most financial support? They haven't really given us a lot of guidance on that, and I'm honestly not sure if they're going to. But when you think about financial support, is one parent paying child support, like court-ordered child support? Is one parent paying health insurance, bills, clothing, school supplies, paying more in food, paying more towards like housing the child? And it's really up to the discretion of the parents to figure that out. Now, good question. What if it's 50-50? If you truly cannot figure out which parent provides the most financial support and it is 50-50 down the middle, then the FAFSA says you need to use the parent with the higher income and assets over the past 12 months. So whichever parent has the higher income assets would then have to be the parent that's reported. And that's only in the case of 50-50 that you would look at income. If it's not 50-50, again, it's just the parent that provides the most financial support. And I would just say use your best judgment in terms of how you would determine that. Thinking about some of those big costs, those big bills, and how do those get taken care of. So I did see a question about, I want to go back real quick about the UTMA or the UGMA accounts and how those would be reported as an asset. Those do get reported as a student asset. So the student is the one that would have to report the investment with the UTMA or the UGMA accounts, and it would be reported under the student investment questions. I believe that that's the same, even if the grandparent is the custodian and the student is listed, then I do think it would still have to be reported as a student asset. but I might need to double check that. I'm trying to see if I can find it real quick. About if a grandparent owns that account. Um, okay, actually, if it's a grandparent, well, that's for 529. If it's a grandparent owned 529, it does not get reported on the FAFSA. But I'm not sure about the UTMA. I might need to look that up after when we get to the questions, like at the end. I'll double check that because I'm not sure and I don't want to give you the wrong answer. UTMA is a Uniform Transfer to Minors Act. I don't know. I think if you have an account, you would know more about it. Unfortunately, I don't know a lot about those accounts. That's why I had to double check. I just know that if it's a typical, like, parent has the account with the student as like the custodian or no, as the owner of the account, then it is considered as a student asset. And we can always go into more details too, like I said at the end. Okay, so they get to the parent information, it's going to walk the student through those questions to figure out who needs to be on the form. Whichever parent or parents need to be on the form, the student will have to invite them. So the student is going to have to list the parent's name, date of birth, social security number. If there's two parents in the household, they need to list that information for both parents. If there's one parent in the household, they only need to list that information for one parent. And then they would hit send, and they would be able to complete the student section of the form. So then the student section would be done. Okay, now the parent would then receive an email with the link to go on and to finish the parent section. If the email doesn't come, the parent can always go to studentaid.gov, log in once the student has done their portion, log in, and then they can complete the parent portion that way. So even if you don't receive the email link, just go to studentaid.gov and you can officially complete the parent portion that way as well. Okay, so this is a little screen grab of the steps that the parent would have to do. Now, if you'll recall, the student section was a lot longer. There's more sections, there's more questions. The parent section should honestly be pretty fast and pretty easy for parents to complete because it really is two sections. It's really just demographic information and financial information, and then you sign and submit. But the one thing I want to mention is that there is something this year called consent. Consent has to be provided by all contributors. Now, contributors could be the student, could be the parent's spouse, the student's spouse, right? Depending on the household situation. Basically, if your information is required on the form, you are called a contributor. By no means does that mean that you must contribute financially towards the student's education. So sometimes I have parents that are like, well, I'm not contributing financially, or I don't want to be on the student's loans. You won't be. By doing the FAFSA form, you are not legally obligated or obligated at all to pay financially towards their education, and you are not linked to their federal student loan. All it means is just that you have to enter your information on the form in order for the student to be considered for financial aid. Without the consent, without the parent information for our dependent students, they cannot be considered for financial aid at all. So it's really important that parents are helping students to complete this portion and also to check to provide the consent. The consent is basically consenting that you're the one filling out your questions, that you're filling it out to the best of your knowledge, as correct as you can. And it also is consenting to pull your tax information from the IRS. And so there's a process called the IRS Direct Data Exchange, where once you provide that consent and you get to the financial section, it should automatically transfer your tax information right onto the FAFSA. So it's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of questions that you would have to enter if you file taxes, right? It's going to automatically pull that information over. Now, it may not work. There are situations where it might not work. If you've ever had any type of identity theft in the past, it's not going to let you use the tool. You'll have to manually enter that information. Or if, for example, in 2022, you filed married filing joint, now on the FAFSA, you're reporting that you're divorced because your marital status doesn't match your tax filing status. very wordy, because those two things don't match. It's going to make you manually enter your tax information. So there could be situations where you will have to manually enter that. And that's why I always recommend to still have your tax returns and W2 forms available if you have them, just in case you need it. You may not. Best case scenario, you don't need it, but at least if you know where it is or you have a digital copy saved somewhere, you can grab it or use it as needed. Okay, now after completing the FAFSA application, you will also want to make sure you complete the Pennsylvania State Grant Form. The State Grant Form is a one-time form. So the first time a student applies for financial aid, they need to complete the Pennsylvania State Grant Form. After that first year, once they do that form once, they don't have to do it again. It's a very quick form. It'll take you maybe 5-10 minutes to complete. It's not like the FAFSA, there's no like financial information on there. It's just a couple of quick questions for the student in order to be considered for the state grant. Now, a couple things. Let me take a sip. Okay. There are some changes. Of course, we talked about changes to FAFSA, but we at PHEAA are also updating a lot of our systems this year. It just so happened to coincide with the changes to FAFSA. Yay us, right? And yay you, but it's okay. So the biggest thing is that our system might not be ready until maybe January or into February. So the biggest thing that I would just recommend is the state grant form does not have a specific deadline. The only deadline for state grant is that you do your FAFSA by May 1st. You could do the state grant form on August 1st or September 1st. Okay, so there's not a huge of next year, right? Like of the student's year attending college. So like September 1st of 24, you could technically do the state grant form and still be considered for the state grant program. Okay, so it's not a huge deal when you do this form. And typically most students will do it over the summer. So, but I would just recommend maybe make yourself a note on that master calendar or in your phone, maybe in March, just in case it takes us or it's a little bit delayed with getting the new system up. I would just say in March, go out there to PHEAA.org, have your student create a student account, and then once they log into that account, they will be prompted to do the state grant form. So that's going to just be the easiest way this year to do it. And again, once it's done this year, they won't have to do it again. So I would just make a reminder in March. And then also once the systems are up and running properly, we are also going to email students. So if we've received FAFSA, but we haven't received the state grant form, we're going to send reminder emails out to students as well. But I would just make yourself a note just in case, hey, get this done in March. And that way you know it's done and it's not something you have to worry about later. This is a screenshot of right now, the link for how you would go to create the account. I believe this will still be the same. So going to our site and following for state grant program, it's just that the hyperlink to sign in and create the account will be different. So if you want, you can take a screenshot of this. Again, you're going to get this emailed to you, but this is just something I would wait to do until March. Okay, in addition to FAFSA state grant form, there may be one more form you need to complete, and this is called the College Scholarship Service Profile or the CSS Profile. The CSS Profile is used by about 400 colleges and universities in order to award their institutional aid. So I definitely encourage families, you can go out there to collegeboard.org, and under CSS Profile, you can look at a list of all of the schools that require the profile. Again, it's about 400. Out here in Allegheny, the two that I know of offhand are Duquesne and CMU that require the CSS profile. Now, the CSS profile opens up every year on October 1st. It is currently open. So it is out there. It's available for students. If schools require the CSS profile, they usually have very early deadlines. They might have deadlines in November or in December. So if a school requires you to do the CSS profile, you are going to do that now, even though you haven't even done the FAFSA application. So you'll do CSS profile November, December, and then you would do the FAFSA in January. I saw a question about head of household and if that's who provides the most financial support. I mean, not necessarily. There's divorce agreements and things where the one parent gets to claim the student as and use head of household and the other one can't, or it rotates years. So who claims the student does not impact who's providing the most financial support. So you would really want to kind of look on the side of things and really kind of tally up and see who you think truly is providing the most financial support. I don't know that I don't know that it's easy enough to just say, oh, well, this person's head of household, or this is who's claiming the student, just because I know there's situations where it doesn't match up and it's just based on the agreement or based on something that changes year after year. And really, you wouldn't want to change the parent on the FAFSA year after year. Once that's the parent on the FAFSA, unless something drastically changes, you really want to keep it the same, just because it can cause issues. Like if you're trying to change every other year the parent on the FAFSA, that could really cause some issues and just make things a little more complicated. But it's a good idea. But yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't matter um, who claims the student on taxes. That has nothing to do with who's providing the most financial support in FAFSA's eyes. Question about if your student is not applying to Duquesne or CMU, do we need to fill out the CSS profile? You may, depending on the schools that they're interested in. I will tell you the state schools here in PA do not require the CSS profile. Our state relateds or Pitt's, Penn States do not require the CSS profile. But if you're looking elsewhere, I would double check. I would go to collegeboard.org and just double check to see if the schools do require it that you're interested in, because you never know. Another question is, does it have to be updated every year? That's a good question. I'm not sure. It might honestly depend on the school. I don't know that they require you to update it every year, but some schools might. The thing with the CSS profile is every single school that requires the profile can require things differently. They can ask different questions. They could maybe require the form every year while another one might not. So it's very subjective to the schools that require it. So that's a question I would ask. If you find a school that requires it, maybe just reach out to them just to say, hey, I'm just curious, is this something I'll do every year? And is there a deadline, right, that I want to be aware of when it's due? Okay. Additionally, I want to mention special circumstances. So you're using 2022 tax information on the FAFSA. It's already almost the end of 2023. And by the time your student is going to school, it's going to be the fall of 2024. Things could change. Things might look very different. So if there's a situation where maybe a parent loses their job or family has a reduction of income, you can reach out to the financial aid office. Let them know, hey, here's a special circumstance. This is what's happening, what's going on with us, what has changed. They can ask you for some more information, and then they can use that additional information to determine if that has any impact on the student's financial aid. And if so, they can adjust the student's financial aid accordingly. So I just want you to be aware that, special circumstance is a process that is available any year that a student is considering higher education. So if something is to ever change, right, a family member, parent loses a job, whatever it might be, reach out to financial aid to see if it has an impact and will make a difference. Yeah, another question about CSS profile, is it required by out-of-state schools? Yes, a lot of, not necessarily required by all, but there are a lot of out-of-state schools that require the CSS profile, and not just necessarily of their out-of-state students. But again, I mentioned it's like 400 colleges require the CSS profile. I think there's like 20 in Pennsylvania, which means the other 380 are in different states. So typically if a school requires a CSS profile, it's for both in-state and out-of-state schools. From what I have seen, that could be different, always worth checking. But just looking at like the numbers of it, there's a lot of schools that are in different states that do require the CSS profile. And that's why you want to look at the list. You can filter by state. You could filter by the name. You could search name by one, whatever you want to do, but just you'll double check that at collegeboard.org. Okay, so you fill out the forms. You fill out FAFSA state grant form if it's required by your school, the CSS profile, and then what? Well, once all that information is filled out, then you end up kind of waiting. And you might have to wait for a month or two. So typically what will happen is the schools will receive the information from the forms and they kind of just sit on that information for a bit. The reason is because they don't start to process that information until a student has been accepted to their school. Once the student is accepted, that's when they'll start to process and determine what financial aid the student is eligible for. And then they will send the student a financial aid notification. Okay. Now, these financial aid notices look very different depending on the school. There's no standard format, so it could look very different. So the things you want to think about when you're getting those financial aid notifications, they might come in the mail, they might be emailed to the student. I would say, if let's say you applied to 10 schools and you're accepted to 8, you would receive 8 different financial aid notifications, one from each of the schools you are accepted to. These aid notices might come in March or early April, right? So you're going to get them sometime in the spring once FAFSA is done. And then once you get that aid notice, you can really start to compare, what financial aid is being offered to me at different schools, what's money that has to be paid back versus money that I'm free money, right? And then overall, if I decided to go to that school, how much leftover would I owe? How much would I be responsible, me, the student, be responsible for coming up with, whether that's paying it or getting another loan? Okay, now I'm going to go through very quickly the different types of aid that would be included on the financial aid notice. Of course, any institutional aid, if they're offering you an institutional scholarship or grant, of course that's going to be on your financial aid notice. But in addition to institutional aid, if you are eligible for any federal aid programs, those would be included on your financial aid notification. So just by completing the FAFSA, you're considered for all of these types. 3 of the top types that are on there are financial need based. So based on household size, family assets, family income, etc. Okay, so the federal Pell Grant, that is really the main federal grant program. Currently, the maximum grant is around $7,395. That's the max amount. The minimum amount, if you're eligible, might be around like $600 for the year or somewhere in between. If you qualify for the Pell Grant, you will receive a Pell Grant of X amount, and that amount stays the same no matter where you go to school. So let's say you qualify for $1,000. No matter which school you go to, no matter what the cost is, you would receive a $1,000 Pell Grant. That's from the federal government. If you don't qualify for the Pell Grant at one school, you're not going to qualify at any school, right? Eligibility is the same across the board. Federal Work Study we'll talk about in just a bit. That's a need-based program. And then there are federal student loans. We're going to talk more about the federal student loans, but the important thing to know is that there is one type that is need-based. So not all students will qualify for it. And there's another type that is non-need based. Okay, so we're going to talk about those loans in just a few. Okay, now with the Pennsylvania State Grant Program, this is a need-based program and it's through the state. So it's a little bit different than the federal government. So it's here for in-state resident students. You can see at the bottom of the page, there's like a cost here breakdown. So the one thing to know about the state grant is we do take into consideration the cost of the school. And that would be cost for tuition and fees. So depending on the cost of the school, that could impact the total maximum award amount you will be considered for. So for example, 0 to 12,000 is our community colleges. The maximum in-state award could be $3,058, and that's currently. The cost for a private school, or the max award for the private school, anywhere above 29,000 or above, the maximum state grant award is $5,750. So you can kind of see, like, depending on the cost of the school, your maximum award eligibility differs. So that's like the one thing that's different than the Pell Grant. I will also say our calculation is a little bit different than the Pell Grant. So just because you're not eligible for the Pell Grant doesn't mean you won't be eligible for the state grant. So, our criteria is a little bit different. Now, I also want to mention if you're thinking about going to school out of state, but you might go to school in either Delaware, DC, Massachusetts, Ohio, Vermont, or West Virginia, you can still be considered for a reciprocal Pennsylvania state grant. However, our reciprocal state grant maximum is $600 a year for our full-time students. So that is a lot less than if they stayed here in state, but $600 is still better than zero. So you still want to make sure you get your FAFSA submitted every year by May 1st. Now, as I mentioned, work study is a need-based program. So you do have to be considered for work study based on, or you will be considered for work study based on your financial need, based on the FAFSA, questions and information. But one thing to know is it would be included on your financial aid notice if you're eligible. But if you're eligible, it just means that you are eligible to apply. There is no guarantee that you will receive a work study position. In fact, these positions are usually very competitive. You might have to submit a resume or complete an interview process. But then if you're selected and you begin working, you will earn a paycheck every week or every 2 weeks for the hours you work. The money does not get applied to your bill at that college, but it is just extra money the student can earn. And then the student can do whatever they wish with that money, go buy pizza or save it for a future semester. Now, lastly, on your financial aid notice, if you are eligible for federal student loans, these would be included. Now, any student, regardless of financial need, if they are a US citizen or an eligible non-citizen, they will qualify for a federal unsubsidized loan. So any student, US citizen, eligible non-citizen, as long as they meet that criteria and they do the FAFSA, they are considered for a federal unsubsidized loan. That is the non-need-based loan. Okay. Now, both the subsidized, the need-based loan, and the unsubsidized loans are in the student's name. There's no credit check, there's no cosigners, there's no payments required while the student's in school. And currently the interest rate on those loans is 5.5%. Now, the difference though is the subsidized, the need-based loan, the government pays the interest on that loan while you're in school. So if you borrow the subsidized loan, when you graduate, it's the same amount. The unsubsidized loan, the non-need-based loan, the interest begins accruing on that loan once the loan disperses. So you get that loan your first year. When you graduate, it is slightly more, right? Because it has increased throughout the 4 years if you're going for a 4-year program. So how much can you borrow though? For a first-year dependent student, the maximum they can borrow is $3,500 as a subsidized loan. And if they qualify for that subsidized loan, they'd be offered then a $2,000 unsubsidized loan. So the maximum a first-year student, dependent student can borrow is $5,500 for the year. Now, again, of that, no more than $3,500 can be a subsidized loan. And if the student doesn't qualify for the subsidized loan, they'd be offered a full $5,500 unsubsidized loan, the non-need-based loan, the one that does accrue interest. As a second year, the loan amount for the year increases to $6,500, and a third and fourth year, it increases to $7,500. And this is for the full academic year, right? So if you're going for fall and spring, this is for the full fall and spring. And it would just be cut in half in fall, half in spring. This is the only loan that the student can get without a cosigner, without having, a credit check, debt to income ratio, really without having a parent or someone who'd be willing to cosign. And that's extremely important to mention because sometimes you think like, oh, I can just borrow whatever I need to cover the cost, but that's not necessarily the case. So when you get those financial aid notices and you start thinking about the cost of what the school would be, you have to figure out, do we have the money we need? And don't just think about the first year, right? If it says, hey, your balance for 1 year is $6,000, what you need to think about is if it's a 4-year program, you need to take that $6,000 and multiply it by 4. So really your cost that you should be thinking about is $24,000. And is that the amount that we can afford? Because you don't want to just get the student in the door, because you will blink and the second year will be there and you're going to owe all that money over again. So you want to make sure that if your student likes that school, that they can stay and complete their whole program there. Now, if you need to borrow additional money to help cover the cost, there are additional loan options. However, they're going to require a parent or a guardian. The first option is a Parent Plus loan. So this specifically requires a parent to apply. It's a federal loan. It's in the parent's name for the life of the loan. So the parent is the one to borrow this loan on behalf of the student. Now this, like I said, it's a federal loan. Interest rate currently is 8.05%. On top of that interest rate, the federal government charges origination fees of about 4.26%. They take that fee right off the top. You never see that fee, but you're going to pay interest on it. If you want to learn more about the Federal Direct Plus loan, you can go right to studentaid.gov. The other option are private alternative loans. These are from private lenders or financial institutions. Typically, we see that these are loans in the student's name, but 99% of my students need a cosigner or someone who'd be willing to co-borrow on that loan. Now, the interest that the lender is going to offer you is going to depend on the cosigner's credit score, debt to income ratio, on the amount that you borrow, on the repayment plan you choose. So there's a lot more terms that vary with these private loans. So you definitely want to consider all of your options and the different options before you just go with one lender, and make sure you read the fine print. Now, PHEAA, we do have our own private alternative loan. This is a loan. There is a credit check. We do ask about debt to income ratio. This is different than the Federal Direct Plus loan. So this is a loan. So it's not all families are going to be approved for the PA Forward loan, but we specifically created this loan a few years ago to give our families a little bit more affordable interest rates. That being said, it's one of the options out there. I want you to look at all of the options out there. Don't just go with this one because I'm telling you about it, but definitely compare all of your different options. One question I get every time is, if I'm a PA resident, but I'm going to school out of state, can I still apply? Yes. So as long as you're a PA resident, even if your student is going to school out of state, you can still apply. Necessary things to consider. I always talk about this because I think it's important for students to think about, what do they want to major in? Based on the major, what are your different career options, and how much might you earn after you graduate? And depending on your earning potential, what can you truly afford to borrow in loans? Sometimes I talk to students and we look up their salaries, and entry level, they're going to be making $50,000. And then when we look at the cost of the school that they want to go to for 4 years, we're like, oh, that's $100,000 you're going to be borrowing. Are you really going to be able to pay off $100,000 in loans with a $50,000 salary? And these are conversations we have to have with the students. And I have a link at the end that I'm going to share with you that can help students to start to think about the cost and what borrowing would look like. Another thing too, out-of-pocket costs beyond just what you're billed for. So thinking about costs like books. Books cost about $1,000 to $1,200 a year on textbooks. That's an out-of-pocket expense that you also want to make sure you're aware of and thinking about. In addition, if you have to travel, right? If you are going somewhere out of state and you have to get back home 4 times a year when the residence hall closes, that's another cost that the school might not tell you about, but that you want to make sure you're considering, and that should be part of the calculation. So what can you do now? Visit college websites, write down those important dates, learn about any additional applications you need to complete. Utilize net price calculators. If you go to collegecost.ed.gov, you can look at the different net price calculators for each of the schools you're considering, answer some general questions about yourself, and based on those answers, it's going to give you a general idea of what the cost for you could be to go to that school. And you can run the net price calculator at all the different schools you're considering to just get general ideas. Again, it's an estimate, so you can't write home and be like, oh, this is the cost, but you can at least get an idea. Additionally, it's now currently available. There's an Estimate Federal Student Aid out there. So there's an aid estimator. It's a shortened FAFSA. It'll take you maybe 5-10 minutes to complete. You answer some generic questions that are going to basically be on the FAFSA. And based on your answers, it's going to give you a general idea of what federal financial aid you might qualify for. This is just federal, so it's just like Pell Grant, and it gives you an idea about work study and the loans. But you can play around with the numbers. You can play around with assets, income, etc., and see what difference it has. Talk about what's affordable, explore scholarships, and then I would say in December, create the FSA ID accounts, and in January, go on there to complete the FAFSA. Now you can follow PHEAA on social media. We do have other webinar opportunities. We do post more information about financial aid and things to consider. So I definitely encourage you to follow us. 2 of our additional webinar opportunities are on the screen. Again, I'm going to send you all of these slides so you'll have this information. These webinars are going to be out there in the spring, thinking about FAFSA, completing the FAFSA and what that looks like. And then in March, I'm doing the one on understanding and comparing financial aid offers. So going more in depth about ways to pay, things to think about, etc. Important resources. The one thing I wanted to share is the mysmartborrowing.org website. That's the website that gets students to start thinking about the cost of the school, how much they might earn, and based on the borrowing amount, what their loan payments would be every month for 10 years. So definitely encourage you to utilize mysmartborrowing.org and some of the other sites that are up there as well. The scholarship sites are at the bottom. These are 4 national scholarship sites. There are many more beyond the 4, but I encourage you to start with this list. Start to browse scholarships. Again, it's never too early to start your search process, and then feel free to go beyond this list if you are interested. My contact information is here. You can reach out to me with any questions that you have. I do hope that this webinar was helpful. I know it's a lot of information shared very quickly, but I hope it was helpful. And if you have questions, throw them in the chat. And I will start to go through those in just a bit. But I want to just thank everyone so much again for attending, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening. So thanks, everyone.